Hey everyone, an old-based dad, yeah. Had a quick thought I wanted to just unpack. Have you heard before how people say that the body uses glucose, blood glucose, as a preferential fuel source? Meaning that if presented with both fat and glucose over a certain threshold, the body will preferentially switch to using glucose as the primary fuel for energy until there's no glucose around anymore, and then those cells which can use fat will switch back to using fat. And this gives rise to the misunderstanding that fat is an alternative energy source. Um, I think the reality is it's actually the primary energy source or the preferred energy source. And what I mean by that is the conditions within which the body will switch to using glucose preferentially as the primary energy sources, the energy for all cells that can use glucose, is only ever where glucose is provided in excess. Think about that for a second. What happens when you eat carbs? So if you imagine you've got this range, low end, high end, but there's this range of blood glucose that is healthy. And you want your blood glucose level to be somewhere within that healthy range at all times. That's optimal. That's healthy. And it's a range. It's not a specific number. There's a range to it depending on your sex, your age, ethnicity. There's a bunch of factors that can come into it, but there's a range that would be optimal blood glucose levels for you as the individual. Now, when you're eating carbs, what tends to happen, depending on the amount of carbs that you're consuming, but let's say you're someone who favors carbs as the primary energy source, so you're eating quite a lot of it, you're eating that to the exclusion of fat because you want to use carbs to provide your energy. Right, so that's the setting. What you tend to find is the person who eats a lot of carbs, when you digest those carbs and assimilate those carbs, your body will see a spike, a rise in blood sugar level, blood glucose levels, and it'll go outside of that optimal range. Right? And that's well understood. Like you get these spikes after meals, and you can people with CGMs will be able to see that exact data readout. They'll have a meal and they'll be able to look back at the data and see that track, that spike of blood glucose above the top end of the optimal range because you're heavy on carbs, because you want carbs for energy. But you'll see you go above that top end of optimal and you go outside of it. So now you're into hyperglycemia. Right? And it's just a temporary excursion because what your body does is your body will immediately seek to remove that excess, so everything above that optimal line to where the top of the spike is, everything in this range, your body will immediately start working at getting that out of the bloodstream. And it'll use for energy what it can. So it will shuttle all of the glucose that it can into cells for energy via the GLUT4 transporter as much as it can, push them into cells to be used for energy for the burning up and production of ATP. So you will, as a priority, start using that excess of blood glucose towards energy production, or like use it for energy in your cells. Doesn't necessarily form any other function. So that's the first thing it'll do. The other thing it'll do is it will convert and store as glycogen in the muscle and in the liver. So in your muscle tissue and in your liver, you will store glycogen for use later. And that glycogen in the muscle and in the liver is used to propel high intensity effort. Right? So that's why people like to talk about carbo loading and stuff like that ahead of a performance-based event or whatever it might be. But that's the whole carbo loading thing. Is it's the intramuscular glycogen and the liver glycogen stores, but those are limited stores. There's only so much capacity to them. They're not endless, and they don't sort of grow out the more carbs you eat. It's a limited capacity store. Once that's full, so you've used for energy what you can. You've stored glycogen for later in your muscles and in your liver to the complete capacity of the muscles and the liver. Those stores are now full, and you've still got excess in this spike of blood sugar. You've still got excess there. That's converted into fat, and that's sequestered into adipose tissue for energy use later. Right? So it's not stored as carbs. That's an important bit to grasp. You don't store that as carbs. It's converted into fat, and it's sequestered into your fat cells for energy later. Like that's your storage for later. But the key thing to take away from this is that the body will always seek to get that blood glucose level back down into that optimal range. So where you've eaten something and you've had a spike, your body will immediately change what it's doing energy-wise, whether you're burning fat or whether you're used to burning carbs, whatever the case may be. Your body will then prioritize getting that blood glucose back down. And it'll do that by burning as energy what it can, everything that's available, like whatever demand you have at the time, it will use as energy. It will replenish your liver and intramuscular glycogen stores if they need replenishing. And excess beyond that will always be stored as fat. Right? That is your body's mechanism to get that excess glucose out of your blood because it is toxic. It is toxic to have hyperglycemia. It is toxic to be above that optimal range. And obviously, the further up you go, the higher out of that range you go, the more that toxic effect becomes acute. But it is toxic to be out of it. And that's why the body immediately switches to trying to get rid of that glucose. That does not mean that glucose is the best or the optimal fuel source for your cells. Right. And the reason I say that is your body is continuously producing blood glucose in your liver and to a lesser degree in your kidneys via a process called gluconeogenesis. This runs 24/7 all the time. It's a biological mechanism whereby your body will be taking lipids and proteins, so fats and proteins from the foods that you're eating, and it will be converting those into glucose. And this happens all the time. Now, why would that be happening if we were meant to be eating carbohydrates in large quantities to provide all the blood glucose that we need? Why would we have this other mechanism? See, I used to think gluconeogenesis was sort of like a failback switch. I used to think that it would be off until needed, and then it would turn on and the body would kick in and produce it. So I used to think of it as like a secondary thing that you could fall back on if there wasn't sufficient glucose in your diet. But that's not the right way to think about it, because in fact it's on 24/7. It works 24/7. So anything that, so it's a good way to think about it, a good way to conceptualize this is gluconeogenesis runs 24/7. And it produces all the blood glucose needed to put you within that baseline optimal level, within that healthy range. Because on its own, in the complete absence of exogenous carbs, and I know this because I follow a carnivore lifestyle, anyone who follows a keto or carnivore lifestyle and really restricts their carbs but uses a CGM will have seen in their data output that via gluconeogenesis, so by the lack of exogenous carbs, you stay stable within that optimal range. You don't drop below it. And that's another thing. When I first started looking into nutrition, started trying to understand all of this, I used to think that, okay, I'm going to cut carbs out of my diet. That'll see my blood sugar plummet. Like, is that good? Is that bad? Like, it was a fear that I had. That doesn't happen because gluconeogenesis works all the time. And it works specifically to convert lipids and proteins into glucose to keep you in that optimal range. And you stay pretty stable within that optimal range until you introduce exogenous carbs. Now, when you introduce exogenous carbs, it spikes again. And that's why it spikes, because you're constantly in this optimal range, because gluconeogenesis is constantly there doing its thing for you. Right? So why would you have a biological mechanism that keeps your blood glucose in that optimal range if you're meant to be getting that glucose, that blood glucose, from exogenous sources? If you're meant to be eating it, why does eating it push you out of that range? Why does your body work so hard to get you back into that range? By getting the blood glucose out of your blood. Right? It works really hard to get that excess glucose out of your blood, because excess glucose in your blood is toxic. It's not good for you. The body immediately works to get it out, to get it away, and it'll do that. It wants to burn it off as energy. It wants to sequester what it can into your muscle and liver glycogen stores for use later when you need it. And then all the excess beyond what those two mechanisms can use, any excess beyond that, is stored as fat. It's converted and stored as fat. Your body does not want you to have chronically elevated blood glucose levels. And anyone who has chronically elevated blood glucose levels develops diabetes type 2, along with a whole range of other issues that will come along with that. But elevated blood glucose, chronically elevated blood glucose, is toxic. It is bad for you and it leads to negative outcomes. End of story. That's not up for debate. It's not an opinion, that is fact. So, getting back to my point, it is incorrect to say that the body prefers to use glucose as an energy source. It does not. It does not. The body prefers to use fat as an energy source. And for those cells that absolutely need glucose, the cells that cannot use fat, the body provides the exact amount of glucose needed via gluconeogenesis in the liver and kidneys, where it converts protein and lipids into glucose, and then they go off to the cells and the functions that need that glucose. But that always keeps you within that optimal range. You sit nice and stable within that optimal range, relying on gluconeogenesis alone. Your energy needs, exercise and everything like that, will be sorted via the fat in your diet. The body will use that for energy. And once you are fat adapted, and that does take some time, because you've got to understand that the excess glucose is so toxic that your body is at the ready to deal with excess glucose, and you have to restrict the glucose and give your body time to realize that, okay, there's no more toxic spikes in glucose coming. We can now focus squarely on using fat for fuel. This is the fat adaptation phase. It'll take 2 to 4 weeks on average, as a rough guess. Individual results may vary, but 2 to 4 weeks for a person to go from running primarily on glucose because they've been shoving it down their neck all the time, to running on fat as a primary fuel source. And then doing that, blood sugar levels will normalize, will come back down into that optimal, that healthy range, and will stay in that optimal healthy range. And it'll stay there for as long as you don't stuff down your neck that's going to cause it to rise. And if you do, and you can do this as an experiment, you've got a CGM, willing to do the experiment, you want to see the data, give yourself Monday through Friday, cut the carbs. See what happens to your blood glucose level. See how it stays nice and stable there. If you're fat adapted, do it for 1 week, Monday to Friday. If you're not fat adapted, I'd encourage you to get into it. Really give it a good go. Become fat adapted. And then watch that data. Watch how you stay stable within that healthy range until you eat something carb heavy. You go eat something carb heavy and you'll see that spike. And your body will immediately switch you from using fat to using carbs as fuel. Not because carbs are preferred, but because the body has to get the excess glucose out of the blood, because the excess glucose in the blood is toxic to your body. It is toxic to your cells. If it cannot be immediately used as energy, it will be stored as glycogen for use later. If it cannot fit into the glycogen stores, which are limited, and once they are full, any additional excess is converted into fat and is sequestered into your fat stores for energy provision later. You do not walk around with chronically elevated blood glucose all the time and remain healthy. That cannot happen. If you have chronically elevated blood glucose all the time, you become unhealthy, you have negative health outcomes, type 2 diabetes, and a whole cascade of negative health outcomes as a result of chronically elevated blood glucose. So, it is incorrect to conceptualize carbs as a preferred fuel source for the body. That's not the reality of it. The preferred fuel source that promotes optimal health and sustained optimal health, is fat. Those systems and cells within the body that require glucose have it provided via gluconeogenesis where necessary, and that runs 24/7 whether you want it or not. It's there and it works and it does its thing. It's like your heart beating. It's an inherent biological function that is always there and is always working for you. Whether you like it or not, that's the reality. And that's because that is the biologically appropriate provision for carbohydrate, or for glucose rather. That is the biologically appropriate provision for blood glucose in your body. The blood glucose that you need is meant to be coming via that mechanism. That's why it's there. That's why it runs 24/7 without you needing to do a thing about it. It's inherent and it's there and it has a function. It's not a secondary mechanism, and you don't need to pour carbs down your neck to provide the carbs that you need. So, fat is your preferred fuel source. Glucose is an alternative fuel source, excepting for those cells that absolutely need it. They are provided for via gluconeogenesis. The only reason the rest of your body can use glucose when it's there in excess is because your body needs to get that glucose out of your blood. Excess glucose in the blood, beyond what is being provided by gluconeogenesis, becomes toxic. You eat something that's heavy in carbs, it will take you out of that optimal range, and your body will immediately work to get you back down into it. And it'll burn for energy what it can, it'll store glycogen where it can, and then it will convert and store as fat. It will not want to leave you with excess blood glucose. Excess blood glucose is toxic. I hope that makes sense. I hope that you're with me. It is at a layman's level, because I am just a layman, but I'm an enthusiast. And this is something that really stood out to me. So gluconeogenesis runs 24/7. That is your biologically appropriate provisioning system for glucose. That is how you're meant to be acquiring all the glucose that you need. You don't need to be stuffing it down your neck. That doesn't serve you well. The reason your body uses it preferentially as a fuel source is because your body has to get the excess out of your blood, because that is toxic to you, it is toxic to your cells, and if it remains chronically elevated, you will suffer, your health will suffer, it will deteriorate. That is the facts of it. So that's a better way to conceptualize glucose and its role as an energy source. It's essential for certain cells and certain systems within your body. They are provisioned via gluconeogenesis, whether you like it or not. But that's why your body does it. It is not necessary to stuff carbs down your neck. It doesn't serve you well. It doesn't help you. The only way you can mitigate the negative impacts of it is by making sure that your activity levels are high enough to be burning that, using as energy as much as possible. But that is not a great strategy to managing your diet. It would be better for you to rely on fat as fuel, to rely on gluconeogenesis to provide the glucose that is required for the cells and systems that need it. And that includes your glycogen reserves. Interestingly, that actually includes your glycogen reserves. Your glycogen reserves will replenish in your muscles and your liver. They will replenish via gluconeogenesis if you're placing the demand on them. So if you're doing the high intensity exercise or activity and you're doing it sustainably, your body will recognize that there is a need for that intramuscular glycogen, and your body will ramp gluconeogenesis up to replenish that intramuscular glycogen after it's become depleted. In exactly the same way as your body would replenish that intramuscular glycogen via carbs if you're doing exercise to deplete it. And then once it's full, it's full. But the benefit with gluconeogenesis is it doesn't continue to ramp. It fills, and then that's that. Then you stay within that baseline, that healthy range. You sit there nice and comfy. That is much, much healthier for you. Much healthier for you. I'll do a more in-depth breakdown on this when I get a chance. I'll include some charts and graphs and stuff to better illustrate what I'm talking about. But it's something that's been on my mind. I've seen a lot of PTs and a lot of health coaches talking about how carbs are the preferred fuel. You've got it wrong, folks. It's not a preferred fuel. The body doesn't preferentially use carbs because carbs are better for you. It preferentially uses carbs when they are in excess because it's toxic in excess in the blood and your body has to get rid of it, and that's a primary mechanism for getting rid of it. That's the difference.